I've just started the recording now. This one is just carrying on with what I looked at a couple of weeks ago in terms of introducing kind of databases. The bits that we're going to look at today aren't strictly in the specification. So when it comes to looking at like the exam side of things, it's not specifically there. But it's, I think, really useful, especially kind of project wise. So for the year 10s, if you haven't done the project with them yet, being able to use databases for more than just searching for data, they might want to save data and that sort of thing in there as well. I also find it's just something that's really kind of worthwhile to give them a little bit more of a well-rounded idea of how databases actually work. Again, it just makes things, I think, a little bit easier for them to get their head around. So even though they won't necessarily need to use this, I think it's something that they should really be introduced to, even if they don't master it, and that sort of thing. So it kind of comes under the SQL, but not searching for data. These are just some of the tips that I've been through a few times before on some of the meetings. So when they're writing the algorithms for exams, just getting keywords in capital letters and that sort of thing just makes it a lot easier for examiners to see what's going on, mark them, and obviously at the end of the day, that's kind of what we're trying to prepare them for. And when kind of they're not too sure what the function is, because generally they're going to be using pseudocode or exam reference language, they'll generally get marked kind of correctly as long as it's clear what they're trying to do and as long as the function name is clear. And there will be a certain amount of leniency around that. So I think that's the main thing. Not really to worry too much about whether it's kind of syntactically correct compared to kind of Python or whatever language that you use. But likewise, writing in their chosen language is fine as well. See, I've been through this before as well. So looking at using prim, and this is what we're going to look at obviously as we go through. I kind of sing the praise of this quite a lot because I find it really useful for teaching. It's useful for both the low ability and the high ability, and you do start to kind of notice as they go through a much better progress and much better uptake of the subject as well, especially if you use this in Key Stage 3 on top of it. And the resources are on CAS if you are interested of what I do, although I haven't actually updated them recently, so there's a few more lessons I need to add on CAS for the Year 9 scheme that we do. And this is kind of where the session is stolen from, really. I'm just kind of reusing bits that I've taught this year with my Year 9s. So this is what it might look like, and you'll see in a little bit more detail kind of as we go through, but it's this idea that they've got a space to predict what they think some code is going to do first before they then have a go at running it, and I get them to copy the code out rather than just download the program, just to get them into the habit of writing the code. Then there's some questions that they should answer to show their understanding of what's going on and help them to kind of notice things really before they can modify some code and then have a go at making some code afterwards as well. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later if anyone wants me to though. So the first bit that I'm just going to look at, and if you want to have access to the files, I believe I've put the files, so like the database and the presentation in the link that you should hopefully be able to see on the screen at the bottom. And that just allows you to download what we're going to be working with. Really what I would be doing before they get into this section is talk about the technique. So this would be one of 4 activities normally, all based around inserting data into a table in a database. So I would talk to them and kind of recap the first 3 lines. So this kind of is from 2 weeks ago, we looked at this. So in Python, you can introduce or import libraries, and one is called SQLite 3, which we can use for contacting databases and accessing the databases. Once we've imported these functions, we can then use these functions, so the connect function and the cursor function, in order to access the database. So in this case, I've got a database called school, and then we're then creating this cursor. And the easiest way to kind of talk about cursors is just a pointer to the database so that we can then use it. It's probably the best way to talk about it with students, just so they understand kind of why it's needed. What we also have is then this execute. This is now slightly different to when they're selecting. When they want to select data, generally you'll want to store the result of this query in a variable so that you can then look through or print the data that comes from it. When we're inserting it into a database, we don't need to store it. If you choose to store it in a variable and you think it's easier for your students to understand that they just put a variable every time, it won't have any effect on the program. So it will still work, but it's just not needed. And so the idea of this is we've got the SQL query that changes inside this execute function, that basically says we're going to insert into a table, and this table is called students. We're then going to insert into the field, so we're going to choose the field name, surname and gender to add into. And we can put as many as we want in there. So if there's 10 fields, we could put all 10 fields there. You can remove this section. So this bit here is not essential. But if you remove it, then you have to add into all fields. So if you use this first section, you can just choose certain fields to add into. If you remove this section, then you have to then add into every single field in that table. Hopefully that makes sense. We then say which values, and they have to be in the same order as we've written them here. So we've got name, obviously we've got surname, and then we've got the gender, so they're in the right order. If I'd put M, Joseph, Smith, then we'd have M in name, Joseph in surname, and Smith in gender. So that bit is important, but I could switch them around and it won't make any difference. So as long as these are in the same order as those, it will work. So I could put surname first, then name, then gender, and then I could put Smith, then Joseph, then M, and that would work in exactly the same way. The bit that is really important though with this is this final line, and that actually saves the executing instruction. If you don't do that, it kind of inserts it, but it then doesn't save the work. Okay. Does that all make sense? Any questions about that at all? So see, what I would be doing is teaching them with an example, and then I'd get them to think about what this program might do. So obviously I've just talked about it, which we can talk about being tracing the algorithm line by line. So I kind of explain certain lines to show what's going on at key points. Then obviously the next bit is where they can then investigate it. So at this point, the same code, so we've got the same code down here, and then there's some questions. So the first one is what the problem with this query might be. Can anyone spot any potential problems or issues? Not necessarily errors, but something that kind of might make this not particularly very useful. Okay, so this program will always only insert those 3 values, obviously, which makes it not particularly useful in there. So it'll always be Joseph, always be Smith, always be M every time the program's run. And so if you run it 10 times, you end up with 10 Joseph Smiths. And so that's where we can then move on to, right, so how can we get some data that changes in there? So maybe the user can type some data in. I did mention this earlier, but the next question that I get them to think about, so they are paying attention, is which table the data is inserted into. So in this case, obviously, it's this students table. A lot of students might talk about the school database instead, and that's kind of one of those common misconceptions that they need to make sure they get their head around. So the database obviously is different to the table. I appear to have had an extra line before I did my screenshot. That should say line 7, and obviously this is to do with the fact that I don't need to have my variable here. So when we use the select, we'd have a variable to store that, and then obviously that variable would then be used later on to read the data or to display the data. And obviously with the insert, we don't need to have that variable. Again, like you see, I covered this one earlier. So which fields have data added to them? So we're identifying these 3 fields in here. And again, because I've got the random space, I don't know what I did there. That should say line 9. And obviously if we remove line 9, this is kind of a chance for them to have a little bit of an investigation as well, kind of modify the code. They can run it without this, and then they can have a look at the database. And so you can use database software to have a look for it. Are any of you familiar with any database software? So we use DB browser. I'm just going to see if I can find it.
Do you prefer that to Access?
Yeah, for this sort of thing, mainly because it's more suited for the types of database. You can't as easily connect to an Access database from Python. This is just a standard database, whereas Access creates its own files.
There's an online one called DB Couch.
Okay.
So you find this works really well with Python, does it, Martin?
Yeah, so all it does is it just creates a very simple kind of database. It's just the most basic database file, a .db file that can be used with any kind of software. So even Access will understand it, but it's just really straightforward. So
eBrowser.
So yeah, so it's DB browser, and you can. I'm just going to see if I find one of my databases. Oh, there was a recent one, I think. There we go. So this is the database. So by doing this, they can then have a look through kind of the fields that are in there, and they can browse the data, so they can see what's going on. And so if they've got this open at the same time, they can run that program with the insert, and then they can look straight away in the code inside the database to see what's happened with the code. Sometimes you have to close it and open it. It depends on your network, so they can see the changes. There is a refresh, which should work most of the time, but like I said, it might not necessarily. If they've kind of made some changes and they haven't written the changes, then it won't let them do anything with the database from the Python side of things either. So there's just a few things in there, but it's just fairly straightforward in terms of they can see the database, they can see the data that's in it, and so when they then run the program, they can then see what's going on. And obviously that then gives them the opportunity to then see, okay, right, so I ran it this time and this happened, but if I run it again without this line, what's going to happen next? Does that make sense? Any questions about that at all? In this case, the modify is just changing it so it adds all details for a new student, so not just the name, surname and gender. So I just said use your details, or they can make something up, it doesn't really matter. So this is making sure that it adds in, I think I put a tutor group in there, and I think I put a year group in there as well, so they just need to add in some extra ones. The make task obviously is slightly different. In this case, it is still very similar. This one is just going to get them to add 3 students to the database. So again, they can just make up some details, and it's just going to need to do 3 lots of it. There's various ways of doing it. The easiest way is just to have 3 of line 7 just for different names. You can put in extra values in here. I think from memory you separate sets of brackets after values, so for each record with a comma, so you might have a comma and then you might have your next set of data and then another comma and then the next set of data, but I can't remember exactly if that's the syntax because I don't use it all the time, because mainly if I'm getting the students to do it, I'll get them just to repeat line 7 3 times because that's what they tend to find a little bit easier. Hopefully that all makes sense. This part is kind of just an extension. I'm going to give you a minute or two just to read through that and see if you can work on prediction of what might happen with this one, how it might be different to the previous one. Can we work out what this one might do and how this might be different? So when this one runs, we've got some inputs that we're going to get, and rather than have the same data every time, it's building in the inputs that are stored in these 5 variables into the SQL statement. One thing that you might notice, and I don't know whether you've seen it before, is this kind of triple quote. I don't know if it's something that you have seen before, but what this basically means is that the SQL statement can go on to multiple lines, or the string can go on to multiple lines.
Yeah, I was trying to work that out when you said what would happen.
Yeah.
What would go on to just keep overwriting onto the same line. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite handy. One of the things when I was taught to program, and I still remember it, is keeping programs to no more than 80 characters wide, so on every line, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. And this just allows it, because SQL statements can get really large. So for example, where you've got kind of, let's say you've got a table that's got 20 different fields in there, and you're going to put values in all 20 fields, that line of code is going to be quite long, and so that just allows us to do it. And what I'm having to do is inside, when I'm trying to add in and write my values, I still need my little quotes that I've got around the numbers, around the values like we have got here. So around Joseph, I've got single quotes to say I'm trying to write a string to this database. And so I've still got those, but then I can close my main string, which I'm using the triple double quotes for. I can then concatenate my name to that string, and then I can concatenate the rest of it to the rest of, or that to the rest of my string, obviously by opening up my string again, and then carrying on. And obviously I have to do that every time, and that's something that can catch students out a little bit. Just a lot of opening and closing speech marks. There are other ways that you can do it, but such as using placeholders and that sort of thing. I tend to find that students find this a little bit easier to understand, as placeholders can get a little bit kind of messy for some of the students, and they're having to introduce new functions, whereas this, they just have to remember that you close a speech mark, you open a speech mark, and it's just about making sure that you check that they're all there. Has anyone noticed what the problem with this code is?
No, not yet.
So this one does have an error in there. This is generally a lot easier, obviously, if you are kind of doing these as you go along, and obviously the students tend to find it a lot easier that way.
Yeah.
And then obviously being able to run it and you can kind of see what happens. So the issue that we've got here is the end of the program, which is linked to the first question that I've given them about why the data is not saved. And that's because we haven't got our commit function at the end of it. And so that's obviously the bit that we talked about up here. That con.commit is needed to make sure that the data is saved in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I've talked about the single and double quote marks as we went through, so I won't go over that again. This one's a little bit interesting. It's not strictly in the specification again, but anyone know why the student ID value doesn't need to be added at all? So this is linked to the database. The database here has got a primary key, which is auto-incremented. So the idea of a primary key is we're kind of uniquely identifying a row, and typically you can get them so they're automatically generated. And so this database will automatically generate the primary key if it's not specified in the insert statement. I said most of the students don't need to know that at all, but for some of your higher ability ones, it's definitely worth talking about, just so they start to get their head around it, especially as they start to create some of their own databases and hopefully go on to A level where they will use databases a lot more. Does that make sense? I don't know how much you guys use databases. It's one of my favourite things to teach, I think. I quite like databases.
I like that.
Modify, hopefully that's fairly straightforward after answering this question up here, this first question. So this is where they are showing that they've kind of learned from what they did in the first activity or a previous activity. And the make one is where they can do the same but for 5 students. Hopefully your high ability ones are going to use some kind of loop to do that. Your low ability might just kind of copy and paste the code as long as they've got a solution. I don't normally mind, because I think the main bit is then finding obviously a solution to a problem, and the kind of developing the better solutions is something that they will kind of start to improve as they go through. And then the next bits, these have kind of only got one example of each of these, but again, I'd have kind of 4 activities for each of the next ones. We'd look at the update the update query. I'll lose my words. Update works in a similar way to the insert, whereas we don't need this variable at the beginning, just like we don't with insert, and we also need to make sure that we are committing the data at the end. The statement is slightly different, so we've now got update here. We say which table we want to update, so a little bit like the insert so far. The next section is what we want to change. Oh, let's get rid of that because then you can't read it. So it's the field that we want to change and what we want to change it to. So I'm changing the name field to whatever the user types in name up here. And I'm also changing the surname to whatever the surname is typed in up here. And obviously we're using the same kind of quotes in there. So that technique, I'm separating each field with a comma in here to make sure that it's obviously clear that I want two different bits of data to be updated. And this will change the data that is already in the table. And then this bit is saying when I want it to happen. Without this bit, it will update every single record to be that name. So that where clause is really important with an update, because if you don't have it, you end up updating all of the records. So if I just go back into my database, so in here, we've got record 5. So Fred Jones would be changed to whichever first name and whichever surname was typed in. So you might change it to Martin Sexton, for example. If I forgot the where clause, everyone would be changed to Martin Sexton, which obviously causes issues with the database and the kind of accuracy of the database as well. So that's just something to kind of get the kids to think about as they go through. Does that make sense? Is there anything with the update that anyone wants to ask at all? Okay. And then obviously investigate questions here. So one of the things I get them to think about is kind of why student ID is used in the where clause as opposed to some of the other fields. Any ideas on why that might be? Okay. I'm sure you've got examples in your school where it happens, but there might be some students that have got the same name. And obviously if there's a student that's got the same name, even first name, and we try and use first name in the where clause, then everyone with that first name would have their name changed. And obviously that causes issues. Student ID can be used because I talked about primary keys. A primary key is a unique value, so every record has a unique primary key, which means that when I want to change it for a specific student, I would use that primary key in there. See what changes we covered in there, and I also covered those two lines. This is another bit where I just kind of get them thinking about the constructs that are being used, just to get them thinking about it. So like I said in the past, I try at least once a lesson just to have a question in there that gets them to identify the constructs that are being used in the program. Any ideas which one we're using? Okay, so here we're using sequences.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. Sorry, I have the microphone off.
Oh.
The table's really squeaky, sorry. I didn't want to, okay.
Yeah, so we're using a sequence here, and it's just getting them to think about it and identify, because I think that's one of the questions that's likely to come up quite often. Here's some code, what constructs are being used. How many fields are being updated in here is another one that's quite nice, so they can see which ones are. See, I've covered that one. And again, thinking about what happens if line 8 is removed. so they can go through and realise that it's the same as the insert. And then we've got the modifier and the make. So this time I want it to change it so it's the year group of the student that changes. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward for them to do. And then the make one is allowing the user to update the year group of all of the students. So it will go through and change all of the year group, all of the students' year group one by one. So they can change the first one to 9, the second one to 8, and so on. And again, ideally talking about getting them to do it as a loop, so it kind of makes it efficient, but obviously they don't necessarily have to. And then the last one is kind of linked to the delete, which again is quite useful. Lines 5 and 7 I've just put in there, or 5 to 7 I should say, just so they can see what is in the database without having to open up the database, which is something that's sometimes quite useful for them. So lines 9, 10 and 11 are the important bits for delete. So 9 is obviously I'm getting a user input. 10 is where I'm executing it, and again I don't need to have any variable. And 11 I'm saving it as well, so whenever we're making changes we need to save it. Delete is kind of works from using delete from and then the table name, where the tutor, so in this case the tutor field equals the tutor that they've typed in. And so it's obviously very similar to what we've been doing before. Like with the update, the where clause is really important. Again, if we don't use the where clause, rather than updating everything, we end up deleting all of the records. And again, that's not particularly useful either. One thing that I will just kind of go over is in the programs, or whenever I'm writing SQL, I tend to write the SQL keywords like delete, from, select and so on, all in uppercase. You don't have to. SQL is not case sensitive. I just think and find it makes it easier for the students to work out which ones can change, which parts of the statement can change, and which parts of it can't change. So that's just kind of a purely teaching side of things. Then we've got the investigate side of things. Any ideas why this program might not run? Or say might not, but it won't run. I think you'll need to be kind of really observant for this one. So in here, I've forgotten to concatenate the rest of my string. So I've got my first plus, but there should be another plus in here. And so this is just kind of an example of me building in programs that have got errors so they can then fix those errors. Obviously that kind of meets part of the specification that they need to do. Then we look at which tutor is being, or which record is being deleted. And so in this case, it's that wherever there's a tutor that equals the tutor that was typed in. And again, looking at the constructs that we've got here. So we've got sequence again, and then we've got iteration up here as well. And then obviously the final bit is just another example of kind of my modifier and my make. And that's about it that I really go through with databases. They have probably about 5 or 6 hours worth of lessons to do with this, depending on how quickly they work through things. And obviously I find it quite useful. Yes, Sarah.
Just, you know, the database program that you have?
Yes.
I wasn't quite sure how in your code there was very little file location to connect with it.
So yeah, that's fine. So that's kind of one of the actually useful bits to talk about. So in here, obviously I've just got the file name.
Yeah.
So as long as the database and the Python file are saved in the same folder, you don't need a file path. So that's kind of something I get the students to do.
Yeah.
Just make sure that it's all saved.
Creating that database and just getting them to hold it in the folder.
Yep. So
stored locally.
I don't know if
they're not going to fetch that then off there. That's quite good, because Access doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah. So I'll just find the example of what I've got.
Yeah.
Just bear with me. There you go. So this is where I've got a database. So where I give the students the database just to download. I tell them to save it in the same area or the same folder that their Python file is saved in, and I remind them here as well. And as long as those are in the same place, then you won't have any issues.
So it's like normal good practice. Everything you're using in your root folder. Yeah, that's fine.
Obviously, if they wanted to have a folder that is databases and a folder that is Python programs, then they would have to include a file path in there.
Yeah. Did you get them to go and set that database up, or did you create it?
No, I created it for them when we were doing this. I generally kind of don't show them too much about kind of making them, because at this kind of level they don't need to.
No, they don't need to do the GCSE.
No. So if they choose to do that sort of thing, it's a really quick thing just to talk to the ones that need it about how to use the software, and I just get them to use DB browser to create it. And then I just show them, right, well, this is where you add a new table, this is how you add a field to the table, and so on.
And are you using DB browser at A level as well, where they need database functionality?
Unless they're using a web-based database, then yes, I'll get them to use DB browser for it.
Very similar to DB Couch, which is a nice web-based one, so that might work quite well.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, that's not one that I've used before, so I don't know too much about it. I don't know where I found this one. One thing that is worth noting, actually, and that I haven't covered, is if they don't save the database first in the right place, what will happen is when the program runs for the first time and it tries to run this line of code, if the database doesn't exist, it creates it a little bit like text files. And what it does is it creates it as a completely empty database, which means that at this point, when you're trying to use students, it will then throw up an error to say students doesn't exist. So one of the common ones that I get from the students is I've saved the file from OneNote in this case, but it's telling me that students doesn't exist, and that's normally because they didn't save students in the right place. And then they say, well, I have, look, and they go into the folder, and that's where, and you can see a database called schools DB in this case. And when you open it up, it's completely empty. And so they just need to make sure they save the database first before they run the program. So just an extra little bit of problem solving. So that's really it for today's session. Hopefully you found that useful. Next week, I think I'm going to look at kind of defensive design. I think it's my next bit in the plan. So how you can kind of make programs so they don't break, and then following that we'll look at testing as well, if people are still interested in the sessions.
Martin, would you be prepared to do another short session on using Teams and Notebook?
Yes, I can do.
Maybe at the end of these, how you might set it up.
So
it seems weeks ago since I've forgotten how to use it.
Yeah.
Just getting into Teams now and getting a hang of that.
No.
Starting to use that with the classes. So I'm just now wanting to look at kind of document organisation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to do that. I'll try and set something up. Yes.
Okay.
It's something I do so much. I think I tend to run about 6 or 7 classes for the staff at my school on it, so it's not something I need to prepare anymore. It's just something that I just talk about, and that's easy enough to do. It's just a little bit of my time.
Then I do that for my school as well, so but I just need to make sure I've got the hang of it first.
Yeah, no, not a problem. I'll look into kind of find some time to do that, maybe over the next week or so, and I'll put an advert out.
Great, thank you.
So that's really it. I'm just going to stop the recording now.
That's a really nice way to do database.